Well, hello everyone. Welcome to week 2 of our history series. This week we're going to be talking about the history of the 4th of July. Oh yeah, go ahead and close that window if you want to. We're going to be talking about the history of the 4th of July and the Declaration of Independence. I think what most of us know about the American independence is the militias and the redcoats ran around shooting at each other, and Congress wrote the Declaration of Independence. They went out and cooked some hot dogs and fired firecrackers, and that's why we have the 4th of July. Yeah. As I got to studying for this, I discovered it was considerably different than what I had thought. I don't know if it's shame on me, or maybe it's been 60 years since I learned about it in school. I don't know. But anyway, I was quite amazed at some of the things I've learned about the 4th of July and the Declaration of Independence. So let's start by going clear back to 1607, when Jamestown Colony was formed and placed in Virginia. Notice what their government was like. The fact that they were there in 1607 and so on doesn't really matter for what we're talking about this week. What we really want to see is the American colonies were what? Look at the second line. British corporations. So just like Alice Chalmers is a corporation in America, the Jamestown settlement or any of the other colonies were just corporations under the crown.
Thank you.
Now they had pretty good self-rule, but Parliament had full control over all foreign relations. Well, that went along for about 80 years, and then there was a minor civil war in Great Britain called the Glorious Revolution. And for our purposes today, the thing we really care about coming out of the Glorious Revolution was the fact that Parliament was given supreme authority over everything, including all aspects of colonial work. So this is 1688. Remember last week when we talked about the first Thanksgiving? This would have been 50 years after the first Thanksgiving. 60. The French and the English have been fighting for as far back in history as we can remember. Just in our lifetime now we've seen things settle down. But they sure didn't like each other back in the 1700s. The French really wanted to push the English off of the American continent. They thought it would be good to have the whole American continent be French. Well, the colonists didn't think much of that idea. The colonists were mostly Englishmen. They didn't consider themselves to be Americans. They were Englishmen. And they didn't like the idea of their traditional enemy trying to take over the land, and the mother country sent over soldiers and navy to help fight. The Americans, what are now called Americans, and the British fought against the French and the Indians. We call it the French and Indian War. Europeans call it the 7-Year War. It was really just part of a global war. And so this, as far as the Europeans were concerned, this thing going on the North American continent was just sort of a sideshow. Yeah, the French and the British were fighting there, but they were fighting all over the rest of the world as well. But of course, that's what we're interested in, is what was happening here in North America. So, 1763, they finally decided to quit fighting, and they came to temporary terms. And the next year, 1764, Parliament said, we need to raise some money to pay for this war we just did. Now, we're going to do it by passing some acts, and we're going to tax the Americans a little bit. Because after all, we were protecting those colonies. So they put limits on paper money, which was a real problem, caused a real liquidity problem, because the only money we could have was coins. So we had, doubloons and all that kind of stuff. And then Great Britain was concerned about their sugar trade out of the West Indies, and so they put embargoes on sugar, wouldn't let us export our sugar, so that caused more problems here. To Great Britain, this just looked like balancing trade. We've got a big investment here in the South Atlantic. We got a little investment in the North Atlantic. We better protect the big investment, not so worried about the little investment. But we Americans, colonists, were sitting over here. That was all of our sugar. May not have been a big thing to King George III or Parliament, but it was a big thing to us. And then it got worse. The next year, 1765, Parliament decided they needed to get even more money from the colonists. And one of the things they implemented was the Stamp Act. You had to have a stamp on all official documents, newspapers, playing cards, and notice I even put a picture of a playing card up there. And the Americans began to say, why is it that we're being taxed to support the British government? We don't even get to vote on it. And as you can imagine, there were different opinions. Over here in the colonies, we were saying, hey, we've already paid a ton of money for that war. Why have we got to pay more? And over on the other side of the ocean, Parliament was saying, hey, we sent a lot of money over there, sending our sailors and our soldiers and protecting you from those Frenchmen. You ought to be paying us for that. But we already paid for it. But not enough. You see the problem. Like I said last week, there were some opinions being presented this week. We had differing opinions on just what should be happening. Well, about this time, fortunately, we had Benjamin Franklin over on the continent going around negotiating on behalf of the United States, and he pointed out how much America had actually put into the 7 Years' War, or as we call it, the French and Indian War. It was almost exactly the same amount as Great Britain had put in. So he talked Parliament into releasing the Stamp Act. Good, we can buy a deck of cards without having to buy a tax stamp from Great Britain. But notice it's just like our current government. The big print giveth and the little print taketh away. And the little print said that Parliament has the right to make laws for all colonies. Ooh. I'm glad we're not paying taxes on our playing cards. But, Congress. Parliament now gets to make laws that affect everything over here. Well, that's not so good either. So some of our people started organizing and talking. The organization that was the most prominent was called the Sons of Liberty. And they started advocating what we today would call civil disobedience. If the Parliament gives us a law that we feel is unjust, we ignore it. Well, we have the same thing today. It's just not called the Sons of Liberty, it's called community organizers. Exactly the same thing. So they were out community organizing, talking to people, organizing, getting resistance against government activity that they didn't like. They wrote up a paper called A Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And what they said was, you guys over there on the other side of the ocean can tax us, but you have to get our permission. You can't just reach into our pocket and take our money. Okay? Theoretically, that's the way we operate. It gets a little foggy sometimes, but that's what the Sons of Liberty were asserting. Parliament wasn't too happy about that. The hotbed of dissent in the colonies was in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So a lot of the initial transactions that we view as affecting all the colonists were really just for Massachusetts Bay. Parliament sent over word, we want you, the governor, to start looking around and see who the troublemakers are. Charlie. Okay. Send Charlie's name back to London. And if he gets out of line, arrest him and send him to London, and we'll try him in London. Yeah. Well, you can see why the Americans weren't real happy about that. There was a pretty large contingent, 2,500, British soldiers quartered in Boston. And in 1770, now keep track of these dates now, this is just 6 years before we signed the Declaration and said we were free of Great Britain. At this point, we still considered ourselves to be Englishmen. The general barracks and courthouse area that was being used by the British representative government here in Boston was where the Sons of Liberty were demonstrating. You know, we want our freedom. Taxation without representation is tyranny. And there were 8 British soldiers out front standing at attention. And the Americans decided, well, they'll throw some things at the Brits. And the Brits' orders were to just stand, but don't hurt the Americans. We want to settle this down. Well, one of the British soldiers broke the rule and fired. Bang. So did the rest of them then. They thought the order had come down. They thought that they hadn't heard the order. Somebody else obviously had. So 3 Americans were killed, several more wounded, 2 more died within the next day, and the Sons of Liberty and others did the same thing people do in political situations today. They chose names to describe things that may not be real accurate, but boy, they sure roused up the people. And that's where the term, the Boston Massacre, came from. Well, yeah, it was 5 people, and if they were my friends or family, I'd have said that was a big deal. But normally when we hear massacre, we think of mass people being killed. Parliament decided, these Americans are really a problem, let's placate them, we're going to remove all of the taxes except on tea. Well, things went along for a while. Americans weren't buying too much tea, but hey, we're Englishmen. We got to have our tea.
He's drinking coffee.
Yeah, I'm drinking coffee. I have a brother who looked into heritage. It's always been thought in our family, been kind of the legend in our family that most of our ancestors came from Great Britain, but nobody bothered to prove it until Bill started looking into it a year ago. Turns out our ancestry is 93-point-something% English.
Wow.
So,
Better start drinking tea.
yeah, so I should be drinking tea. The British government was, of course, enforcing the collection of taxes. They had a gunship over here called the Gaspé. The Sons of Liberty just kind of went out and set it on fire one night. Destroyed the thing. And, you know, kind of thought that there would be a big reprisal of that. There wasn't. Great Britain showed great restraint. And remember, in those days, good communication from here, write a letter, put it on a boat. A month later, Parliament reads it, writes an answer, puts it on a boat. And 5 weeks later, because the wind is blowing that direction, not this direction, they finally get an answer. So 10, 11 weeks round trip was good mail service. Almost as good as today. Well, the Crown had a way to handle these things. From now on, all judges, all governors, all major government administrators will be appointed and paid directly by the Crown. Directly by the Crown. So how are they going to rule on any case that comes before them? Yeah. Well, that wasn't real popular. Notice the dates now. We're moving in. 1773, Samuel Adams started what they called committees of correspondence. Civil leaders, not government, not working for I started to say Uncle Sam, not working for, by the way, the name they used to use was John Bull. No idea where that came from. They would say John Bull, meaning the British, the way we would say Uncle Sam, meaning the U.S. government. Anyway, so these would be people who did not work for the British government. They were not Tories, they were Whigs. And he found people in each of the 13 colonies who really were unhappy with the government, and they started communicating with one another, sending letters back and forth, coordinating, figuring out what they wanted to do. And at the same time, over on the other side of the ocean, there was a tea war. Remember the gasoline wars when we were young kids? Remember when somebody would lower the price of gasoline from 30 cents a gallon to 29 cents a gallon? 0.9. And the guy across the street would change it to 28.7. And everybody would be going over there. And so the first one would make it 28.3, and people would be coming to him. And somebody on the other side of town would make it 26 cents a gallon, and everybody would go over there. And they were playing chicken to see who'd go out of business first. That's where that 0.9 came from. You ever wonder why there's always a 0.9 on the end of the gas? Well, back in the old days when you could buy gasoline for 25 cents a gallon, 0.9 in little teeny print added 4% to the cost. So that was a big percentage. Nowadays, when it's $3 a gallon, down from 4, 0.9 is nothing, but they're just so used to painting that on the signs that they just can't bring themselves to quit. Great Britain had greatly lowered the price of tea in order to run those Dutchmen out of the tea business. They figured if they could sell tea cheap enough, the Dutch tea plantations would go broke, and then the English could raise the price up because they'd have a monopoly. And that's where the oil companies were doing 50 years ago. That ought to make those Americans happy. Now we're really charging really, really low prices for tea. But it wasn't the price of tea, it was the tax on the tea. The Americans weren't upset about the price of tea. They were upset by the fact that Parliament had the audacity to charge a tax on tea without getting our permission. So now, 1773, December, 2.5 years from declaration, we're moving in on it. Nobody at this point has talked about independence. We are still Englishmen. We're just trying to get Parliament to give us our rights as Englishmen. Boston Tea Party, the Sons of Liberty, dressed up as Indians to make it a little hard for the British spies to figure out who they were, and they had a big party, and they threw what would today be worth approximately $1 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor. Well, obviously, and notice the date, right at the end of 1773, so it took a little while to get the letter over and another letter back, and who knows how long it took for Parliament to discuss what to do. Parliament put together a series of acts that the Americans came to know as the Intolerable Acts. Obviously, Parliament didn't call them that, but the whole bunch of acts together were called by Americans the Intolerable Acts. One of the things it did was restricted town meetings. The citizens of a town could have a town meeting once a year only, under the supervision of the British appointed governor and redcoat soldiers, who had the right to terminate that meeting at any time. Well, I'd say that's a bit of a restriction. Any soldier that broke the law would be taken back to England for trial. We didn't like that. Now think about that. This is a standard part of law even today. If any major country takes their army into another country, for instance, when the U.S. went into Iraq a few years ago, the U.S. was in charge. Then before government was turned back to the Iraqis, they had this law in place. So John and Susie Iraqi could not say, Bud, the American soldier, was mean to me, and so we're going to try him for who knows what and execute him according to our laws. To protect against that, we have the exact law that is there. They have to agree that anything that goes wrong with our soldiers, we take them home and try them there under American law, not under the foreign law. Go around to the other side. View this from the point of view of perhaps going back another generation of Vietnamese who lived in My Lai. Okay? They might not be real happy with that. Turned out the U.S. government was good for their word. But we didn't really think the British government was going to be good for their word. They also put gunships off the Boston Harbor. A year and a half ago, you guys threw $1 million worth of tea in the harbor and you haven't paid for it yet. From now on, no ships in or out of your harbor until you pay for it. And by the way, we've got more soldiers coming in, and they're going to live with you, and we're going to decide where they're going to live. Pat Dragoon, we're sending 3 soldiers to live in your apartment. You will feed them and take care of them at your cost from now on.
I'll leave.
Yeah, you'll leave. Yeah, and they'll burn your house down. You see the problem? That was not real popular with the Americans, and at the end of today's meeting, you'll see this showing up in the indictments against Britain in the Declaration of Independence. So now in 1774, 2 years away from independence, but nobody was saying it yet. Maybe some people were thinking it, but nobody was saying it. They were seeing problems with the way the British Army was acting. So the Americans started forming militias. Some of them, the first under a governmental body, the Massachusetts Provisional Council, which was not authorized by the king. That was a council of Massachusetts. Massachusetts? Charlie, you're from that part of the country. What do Massachusetts people call themselves?
I have no idea. I'm a damn Yankee in Connecticut.
Okay. Oh well, Massachusettsans created a militia. There were also private militias established all around the colonies. So picture an area, maybe right here in Fort Wayne, where we had a group of people who were really afraid that the redcoats were going to be misbehaving on a large scale. And we wanted to be ready to do something about it. So we would form an unofficial militia, the militia of Lutheran Life Villages. And we would get together, prepare for the common defense of LLV against criminals or criminal government. So on our monthly root beer float and business meeting, we would pick someone to head up our militia. And so we picked Colonel Cal. Cal is going to be the, and that's the way it worked, by the way. The militias elected their officers. So we've elected Cal, and he can't really run the whole thing, so he appoints a couple of sergeants to help us get things organized. And the two sergeants take their platoons and they start running them through calisthenics and target practice and so on.
How did we get away with practicing and doing all that without the British shooting us?
They had a little more freedom then than they have now. So you were able to do that, and the British couldn't be everywhere. There were only a small number of thousands of Brits in the whole colonies. So they knew the militias were there, but they couldn't do a lot about it. Now, they didn't have nice, safe guns like we have today. They had flintlocks. They used what they called gunpowder, what we today would call black powder. Very, very nasty stuff. Two kinds of nasty. If you accidentally get the smallest spark, it burns, and it burns wildly. Have you ever seen a Western where they have a barrel of gunpowder and somebody pours a trail of gunpowder a few feet and then they light it and it goes along and it goes along and it goes along, and then the hero comes running up there and saves the day? That trail of gunpowder would burn at probably over 100 feet per second. It was not just a nice little, fizzy thing. The other thing was it would absorb water. And then it was just yucky, smelly, powdery, soupy garbage. So most people really weren't prepared to care for their own powder. So people would have at their house a few pounds of powder. Shot was okay, it was lead. You didn't have to worry about the lead going bad. But just a few pounds of powder. And everyone would keep their main powder supply at a central powder house in town. So there'd be a powder house in every town where everyone, just kind of like a bank with safe deposit box or something, would take their powder and store it there for safekeeping. The militias would gather up a large amount of powder because they were out practicing every week, really using up the powder. And so they would have many, many barrels of powder in the powder house. Now, Colonel Cal discovered that there were quite a few people here who couldn't afford to buy a musket. And so the next root beer float meeting, he said, folks, we got to do something about this. So we took up an offering. This is a Lutheran group. We understand offerings. Okay? We took up an offering, and he went out and bought 50 more muskets. And this was very common in those days. So the militia would buy muskets and either lend them to the people. Here, take this home. If we have to call you out to serve in the militia, you've got our musket to serve. Or they would keep them in a house adjacent to the powder house called an armory. And that was very common also. So they would have muskets, public arms that they lent out as needed to people in the public. And they'd also have repair parts there and flints and things like that that they needed. Now, going back to the 1700s, the First Continental Congress was very unhappy about all of these problems that we had just talked about a few slides back. But remember, we are Englishmen. We love the king. But that Parliament is doing us wrong. Dear King George III. Lots of flowery words, lots of love, lots of blah, blah, blah. Get Parliament under control. So they sent an appeal to King, and please make Congress, did it again, make Parliament behave. King George received the letter, and in a somewhat famous letter to Lord North, his Secretary of State, he expressed what was really happening, what his view was of what was happening in the United States. Blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country, and he's the first one who used the word, or independent. King George saw through what was happening, maybe before most Americans did. They either had to knuckle to and do as they were told, or they were going to have to be independent, and that meant we were going to have to come to battle. December of 1774, remember now we're just 18 months away from the Declaration of Independence. Congress calls for a boycott of British goods. Now we finally start to see why there was shooting. What today we would call gun control. The militia had a powder house up in Charlestown. So the British sent 260 redcoats up there to raid the powder house, take everything that was there, take or destroy all of the arms, and bring them back. The word went out to the militias. The militias were too slow, too distributed. They couldn't do a lot about it. The Brits got back to Boston. Ha ha ha, we got your powder. But the word got out to villages farther and farther and farther, and they began sending their militias. Have you ever played that parlor game or that party game where you whisper something in somebody's ear and they tell the next person and they tell the next one and they tell the next one? That was happening between the militias. And by the time it got out to the farthest militias and the word got into the rest as they were massing, there was a monstrous rebellion going on in Boston. Blood was flowing in the streets. We need to rush into Boston and kill all the redcoats before they kill all of the Americans. A group of 20,000 militias. And think about that. A big militia would be into the hundreds. So they had brought militias from a lot of towns together as the word traveled and as they got together. And as they were approaching Boston, the word came out, hey guys, it was rumor. It's bad, but it's not nearly as bad. They talked about it and decided, okay, we'll handle this peacefully. Militias went back home. So I asked myself the question, 20,000 militias against 2,500 redcoats. What would have happened if those militia had just charged in and taken charge of Boston? Would that have been the end of the revolution, or would it just started earlier? I don't know. I got a hunch the British would have sent in more troops and taken it badly. A few months later, February 1775, 17 months from independence, the word went out among the British, disarm the rebels. Disarm the rebels. They knew the truth of the saying that you see on bumper stickers once in a while. Armed your citizen, disarmed your slave. And they wanted to make sure that these troublemakers fellow Brits, but troublemakers, were not armed. The Boston Gazette reported what was going on at that time. Warrantless searches. Warrantless searches. Confiscating arms and ammunition. Massachusetts again called the assembly together, decided what to talk about it, decided what are we going to do about this. General Gage exercised his authority as a ruler, as the representative of the crown, declared the meeting illegal. Go home, this meeting is done. So they all went outside, formed a big circle, and they said, okay folks, we are now the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. And they carried on business for Massachusetts without the crown's blessing. One of the things that they said was, let's send out words to all the militia. We want every militia to have 1/4 of their men heavily armed with plenty of powder and plenty of shot at their house, not in the powder house, so that they're ready to work at a minute's notice, i.e. the Minutemen. So this is the beginning of the Minutemen. A few months later, the Brits in Boston decided they needed to raid the powder house up at Concord. So they were going to go from Boston to Concord. They would obviously have to go through Lexington to get there. The NSA has got nothing on the Patriots. They knew what was going on. We don't know who the spies were, but General Gage's wife was from New Jersey. And I'm not going to go through the battles of the Revolution, but General Gage repeatedly pulled his men back when he could have charged and done big things against the colonials, or the Continentals as they became called. They'd have a major confrontation. The Brits would win. The Americans would fall back. And proper military doctrine says the Brits should charge in, chase the fleeing Americans, take captives, kill, take advantage, and get themselves a second, third victory. And Gage repeatedly pulled his people back. Okay, we've won. Let's go back home. So we don't know how the Patriots knew what was happening, but they did. They knew that there was going to be a significant group of about 750 redcoats sent to Lexington and then on to Concord to confiscate weapons. And the big thing was a major powder house and armory at Concord. Well, look at what it takes to get from Boston up to Lexington. They're either going to have to march west to get across the Charles at a ford, or they're going to have to go across by boat and march up the northerly route. The northern one was faster, but more work. Patriots didn't know. So they sent out a fellow by the name of William Dawes, who rode the southern route. He rode around the Charles, up to the narrow part, and up to Lexington to let people know something's afoot. We don't know just what, but get ready. The Brits are going to be here in a day or two. Paul Revere snuck across the Charles. The Brits had it locked down. You couldn't cross the river without a passport. And so Paul Revere had to sneak across, and he was up almost up here in what's marked East Boston, near Charlestown. And he was looking back across. He had set up his people to watch. So now we've got two people ready to spread the word. Paul Revere and William Dawes. A little side note, there has been a persistent rumor that William Dawes was black. And that should be something that modern day black Americans should think was wonderful. Well, I think that's great. There were black Americans in those days who fought on both sides. I did a lot of digging. I found a couple of unsubstantiated kind of things. Hey, has anybody heard this rumor kind of stuff? But it appears that Mr. Dawes was of Caucasian descent, so I guess that rumor was false. I could not find anything to substantiate it. Okay, so Mr. Dawes went the south route. Paul Revere partway took the north route and then had to wait. And then he was in the bushes watching with his spyglass, watching the tower of the Old North Church. Pretty soon there was a light in the tower. Pretty soon he could have been sitting there for hours. And he watched, and then there was a second light. Okay, and you all know the poem, one if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be. So now he knew the British were coming. They were coming the direct route. So Paul Revere headed up towards Lexington, stopping at every village along the way. And it turns out, I didn't realize this until I got to studying for this talk. The Patriots had a regular messenger service running, their own post office, if you will. And Paul Revere was one of the messenger riders. So the people in the towns knew him. Here comes Paul, he's going to have messages. The redcoats are coming, get ready. And on he went. Paul Revere reached Lexington about 11:30 at night. The redcoats didn't get there until after 3 in the morning. So the Minutemen and the regular militia had 3 hours to get ready. Well, there were only about 200 militiamen. And they lined up across the commons, and they thought, well, we'll hope that we can stop the redcoats. And then the redcoats started coming and coming. And they formed this huge wall, 3.5 times as many. Major Pitcairn came up and said, "Lay down your arms, you," and he used some expletives, which I decided not to include, "you rebels." And Captain Parker looked at it, looked at his men. He knew if he fought, he was not only going to lose, he was going to lose a lot of men. He decided it's best to just back off. We'll fight another day. So he turned around, looked at his men, said, "Okay, men, back up. Everybody go home." Notice he didn't say lay down your arms. Everybody go home. And as the Americans were turning to leave, something went wrong. Someone fired a shot. 250 years later, we're still arguing over who fired that first shot. Probably the best theory that I've read, my personal opinion, for whatever that's worth, is it was somebody on the side. It was neither a militia nor a redcoat. Somebody on the side decided, I'm going to take out one of those redcoats. Again, without orders, the first rank of redcoats started shooting. Several Americans died. Major Pitcairn got things under control, stopped it. The Americans recovered and left, and he marched on. So here was the first shot of the Revolutionary War. They continued on, and they got to Concord. Guess who beat them? The messengers had gotten there first. Paul Revere had been arrested before that. Got away. But it was secondary messages that got up to Concord. And by the time they got to the powder house, it was empty. The Brits were broken up into several groups and given different functions. One group was to guard the bridge, and this is a reconstruction of that bridge. Others were to go to different parts of town. They were confiscating anything they could find. They did find a bunch of shot lead balls. So they took them out and threw them out in the pond, out in the mill pond. What does water do to lead? Nothing. It sinks. So after the Brits left, the Americans just went out and got up all the shot and got it back. They also threw in some food. The flour was ruined, of course, but the dried pork, no problem. Pull it out, dry it off. What you have to do is scrape a little bit off the surface. As the Brits started returning, the militias were arriving, and they didn't have the manpower to fight directly, so they started sniping. The legend is that the Americans all had these wonderful squirrel guns, and they could shoot at great distance, and the British couldn't, and so on. A few of the Americans did have good rifled muskets with rifling so that they could be accurate at out to 100 yards, 50 to 100 yards. Well, a musket could shoot to 50 yards or so, but the balls were all over the place. And that's why they had to fight in arrays. 50 people would shoot, and the balls would go all over the place, but some of them would hit somebody and hurt somebody. And that's what was really happening between most of the militia and most of the redcoats, as they were trying to get back through Lexington back down to Boston. But as more and more militia arrived, there were more and more rifles, and they were able to get ahead of the redcoats and set up ambushes and shoot. And the redcoats would push in that direction, and the Americans would back off. Americans knew where they were. They knew how to get around. The Brits were on foreign soil. They'd regroup, start to move, and the Americans would attack from another direction. Things were looking bad in the mind of one of the officers as they were going past Concord, as they were going past Lexington on the way out. He sent back word to Boston. I think we're in trouble. Send us reinforcements. So as they got past Concord, past Lexington, the reinforcements finally arrived. The Americans had to back off. Now they were outnumbered. But you'll love this part. The reinforcements left Boston so hurriedly that they didn't bring any extra supplies. The soldiers had the 36 balls and units of powder that they carried with them. Each of the little cannon had 8 or 10 shots with them that rode on the carriage, nothing more. But at least they had fighters out there. And then Boston put together the necessary resupply stuff, loaded it on the wagons, and they were going to catch them up. Well, there were some old codgers who were too old to be in the militia. Old people. 60 years old. I don't even remember my 60th birthday. They were too old to be in the militia. Well, they saw what was going on. So they ambushed them. Stop, you redcoats! And kept going. So the old codgers shot the horses off the wagons, started shooting the officers, ended up taking the whole bunch of them captive. All right. Old age and treachery. That's the secret. Congress met again. Nobody said the word independence out loud, but people were talking about it in the hallways. Everybody avoided making it official. They wanted their official position to be, we are loyal Englishmen. We love the king. Please, King George, get Parliament under control for us. didn't do much good. Notice where we are now, 13 months from independence. Each of the 13 colonies in June of 1775 passed a resolution breaking their connection to Britain, saying we are hereby a state, a sovereign nation, 13 sovereign nations. And by the way, if you look at a map closely, the 13 colonies are now 16 states. I didn't know that. Vermont used to be part of New York. You look very carefully, notice that Massachusetts and Maine are the same color. Maine was part of Massachusetts, and they didn't even touch each other. And then, of course, during the Civil War, Virginia split into Virginia and West Virginia. So that makes up the difference. The king was not at all amused. He passed a proclamation of rebellion. Our colonies, they're still British corporations according to the king. And they're in rebellion. And we have to do something about that. Well, the Americans still loved the king, but the French sure didn't. Benjamin Franklin was over talking to the French and the Dutch, and they really did not like the English. They said, well, we don't want to start another war, but if you're willing to have a war with you, here, we'll give you some money, we'll give you guns, we'll give you powder. And we were getting secret support from the French, the Dutch also a little bit. Starting right at the beginning, 1776. Word finally got back and forth, February 1776. Okay, now we're within, what, 4 months of declaration. The British blockade American ports, and John Adams says, they're treating us like an external enemy. The king has declared us independent. Woo! Now we're starting to see the word independence used in the United States. In May, getting real close now, Congress said, I think we're going to need to declare independence. We want a committee to write up a list of particulars that we can present. John Adams, you're in charge. John Adams said, no problem, glad to do it. Jefferson will write it. And Jefferson, for the most part, did, with the help of Adams, John Jay, and I forget who else. Things really started moving in July. July 2nd, they had the basic declaration written. July 2, they voted on it. They passed the basic idea, but they didn't have all the wording right. On the 3rd, John Adams wrote back to his wife, July 2nd is going to go down as the greatest day in American history. We will celebrate July 2nd every year as our Independence Day. July 4th, they did the official vote on the whole thing. John Adams was off by a couple of days. July 4th was the official day when the final wording was sent, was written, and then sent to the printer. It wasn't signed until the 19th. On the 19th was the day that the actual signatures were affixed. Most of them. Officially it was the 19th. Some men had to go back home, had to wait and come back. So the signatures all drizzled in. Everybody who was supposed to sign did sign, but not on exactly the 19th. You've all seen that John Hancock. And the legend is that he wrote it and said, King George III will not need his spectacles to see this. It turns out that's just legend. It didn't even happen. That didn't even show up until 100 years afterwards. But I like the story anyway. First starting the fighting, Battle of Brooklyn, also known as the Battle of Long Island. The Brits drove back the colonials, the Continentals, and the Brits said, come on guys, let's talk. And under a white flag, the Redcoats and the Continentals, actually the Continental Congress, sent representatives to discuss the war. Britain said, we will stop right now if you'll promise to behave. To which the Continentals said, forget it. So now we have a war. Shooting's been going on for a year, and we have a war on our hands. A year later, 1777, and I'm not going to go into the battles and so on of the Revolutionary War. If you'd like to do that, let me know. Maybe we can do that some month. But we're looking at now the celebrations of the 4th of July. 13-gun salutes for the 13 colonies. Parades, fireworks, speeches. Look at that last item. Prayers. Okay, these people who are very popular nowadays. Anything that hints of God or religion must be evil, must be destroyed, can't have anything to do with government. Sure isn't the way the Founding Fathers felt about things. Colonies said, you know, we don't really have a structure even binding us together. We're just 13 different nations at war with Great Britain. So they put together Articles of Confederation. Each state was still sovereign. Each state wrote its own laws. Each state handled its own taxes. Congress could only act if it had a unanimous vote. Talk about a weak central government. Any one of the 13 states had veto power over the whole country. 1778, Washington had troops in the field. 4th of July celebration, celebrated with a double portion of rum. The first state to declare July 4th as a spectral holiday was Massachusetts, 1781, so the war was still raging. 2 years later, the war is slowing down a little, but still going heavily. Salem, North Carolina, decided to hold a musical celebration in honor of independence of America. And it has happened every year right up until the present. So this is the oldest continuously running 4th of July celebration. Finally, September 1783. This was not quick. This was a 7-8-year war. Treaty of Paris. Now I hope you can see the map here. Officially, Britain gave us nothing. All Britain said was, we release our claims to everything east of the Mississippi River. Nothing real clear about the north border. They also gave New Spain back to Spain, and that would be Florida and part of Louisiana. So you look down here at the bottom of the map, this would have been Spanish territory, and all of this up here was no longer British territory, but it wasn't necessarily American. But look at the north edge of that map. All of the Great Lakes, both shores, north and south, were given up by Britain. This was all now open, perhaps American territory. I hope you'll be back next week, because this is going to be really significant in the War of 1812 that leads to the Star-Spangled Banner. Because the Brits said they were pulling out, but they didn't. (1870), 100 years later, Congress declared 4th of July to be a national holiday, no pay. All right, that's the way government holidays should be. The government people shouldn't get paid when they're not working. Interesting thing, 1912, the area in Denmark called Rebild decided to honor the Americans with a 4th of July celebration. Now, if you look at the lower right-hand corner of this picture, you'll see it was taken in 1993, just a few days after the 4th of July. July 1993, my employer sent me to Denmark to teach a week's worth of classes. And they gave me a couple days on the beginning before I had to start teaching so I could get over jet lag. That was nice. And the week before I left, the travel agent called all apologetic. "Oh, Mr. Broom, we're so sorry, but would you mind coming home on the following Monday? We'd save a lot of money if you'd stay in Copenhagen for 2 extra days." Oh. So it was great. I had 9 days in Copenhagen for 4.5 days worth of work. I stayed at the Plaza Hotel, which is right across the street from Tivoli Gardens, which is the largest, they call it an entertainment garden, entertainment park. My room was on the 4th floor. I could actually see into the garden. And here's the picture I took over in Tivoli Gardens. They have the largest non-U.S. fireworks 4th of July anywhere in the world. And so on the 4th of July, I was still the early end of my trip there trying to get over jet lag. And it didn't get dark until something like 10:30 at night there, you know, summer. And they're way north, up near the Arctic Circle. And I was able to stand in my hotel room, look out and see the fireworks in honor of America presented by the Danish people. Boy, I still get goosebumps talking about it. I thought that was pretty neat. 1938, probably as part of the effort to fight through the Depression, they decided to pay the employees for not working on the 4th of July. And then something that's dear to me, having grown up north of Detroit. Detroit I consider to be south suburban Saginaw. I grew up 100 miles north of Detroit in Saginaw, so Detroit was one of our better known southern suburbs. Canadian Independence Day is July 1st. So the city of Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan, 1 mile apart with water between them, 2 different countries, have their combined International Freedom Festival every year over the first few days of July. Now I'd like to take just the last few minutes of our meeting and talk about what is actually in the Declaration of Independence. I think we've all heard a sentence or two, and I have, but I didn't really know what they meant, you know, a phrase or two. But what was in the Declaration of Independence? To start with, they said, we have a reason for writing this document. When in the course of human events becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another and to assume among the powers of earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God, there's that God again, entitled them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the cause which impelled them to this separation. In those days they wrote very long sentences. Let's cut it down to the kind of sentences that we're used to in the U.S. now. It's necessary for us to separate our connection from Great Britain. And it's just proper that we write down why we're doing this. What are we doing? We are taking our place in the world just as God intends nations to do. And now probably the most famous sentence in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was a real earth shaker. The phrase had been used before, life, liberty, and property, but never pursuit of happiness. And it didn't just mean pursuit of having fun and having parties. It meant pursuing whatever happened to come along, happenstance. You know, if you want to make a decision, go ahead and do it. The government isn't saying You are going to be a cabinet maker, so you will be a cabinet maker all your life. That to secure these rights, government are instituted among men. So we have rights given by God. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Why do we have governments? Not to give us those rights. They're already given to us by God. Governments are to secure these rights. So that's why we have governments. At least that's the American concept of why we have governments. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness, period. Those long sentences. So the people should create their own government, and that government should be the kind of government they want that will protect their rights, their God-given rights, from attack. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light or transient causes, and accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Bad government may be better than no government. Most people don't want a revolution. We'll put up with bad government as long as we can. Try to fix it if we can. But when a long train of abuses, usurpations, pursuing invariable the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So this is a document that created America where we live. If the government under which we are living refuses to protect our rights, and it gets so bad that we just can't put up with it, it's not only our right, it is our responsibility to take action against it. We've been patient, we've suffered. King of Great Britain has repeatedly worked against us. And now they list the things that the government of Great Britain has done against Americans. Some of them are redundant. He refuses to assent to our laws. We could write some laws, but they had to go and wait for the king to approve them. He refuses to assent to our laws. He forbids his governors to pass laws that we need. Refuses to pass other laws that affect large groups of our people and causes terrible damage to our people. He's being a tyrant in this. He calls together legislatures in distant places, far from our books. Didn't have the internet in those days. And so the king said, okay, we're going to have a parliament meeting. And we're going to have it way over here in Paducah. And everybody says, where? And they have to get there, and they certainly can't bring their law books with them and their history. And the king was doing that regularly, so people couldn't make laws, even if they wanted to be just. They couldn't be making laws in a educated way. He dissolves Parliament repeatedly, or the town meetings. After he's dissolved them, he refused to give us new government in their place. Endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. The Americans felt that they should have orderly immigration, and the king was overriding their immigration laws, just plain invalidating them. Obstructed the administration of justice and judiciary powers. Has made the judges dependent upon him. Remember, we talked about the judges being picked and paid by the king. He's talking about that here. Has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms. Can't you just picture that? Swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out our substance. You know, the government was growing like crazy, and the king was appointing people in charge of all sorts of things and eating out our substance. Keeping a standing army without our approval. Has an army that's not subject to civilian control. There's a standard that's been in the U.S. forever, since the beginning. The government doesn't run the army doesn't run the government. The civilians run the army. Combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. He was allowing foreign laws to affect America. So just because the government of Europe, European Union, passes a law doesn't mean it's effective here. But that's what was happening. Quartering of troops, trying them back in England, cut off our trade, imposing taxes without our consent, deprived us of the benefit of trial, transports us beyond the seas for offenses, abolished the free system of English laws. Notice they still considered themselves Englishmen. And if you read any body of laws today, you will often find as the last fallback, if there's no law that applies, English common law still applies. So if you can't find a law in the U.S. Code or your state or your city, if there's been a precedent in English common law, it applies. Abolishing our charters, which mean we no longer have proper government, so we had to make our own. Suspended our legislature. Declared us out of his protection, declaring war against us. Plundered our seas, ravaging our coasts. Burnt our towns, destroyed the lives of our people. One of the things I took out because the slides were so long and I'm 15 minutes over time. As they were wanting weapons, the Navy, the British Navy, came ashore on towns and said, "Give us your weapons." And one of the towns said, "Okay, we'll do it, we'll do it." And they gave them 8 antique muskets. And the Navy said, "You didn't fool us." And they went out to their ships and destroyed the town with bombardment. And that's what he's talking about here. You brought large armies of mercenaries. He hired German mercenaries to come and fight here in America. And many of them were from a province in Germany called Hesse, something like that, from which came the name Hessians. And we gave that name to all Germans. Captured Americans at sea and then made them serve in the Navy against Americans. Completely skipped over that. Excited insurrections among us. Encouraged merciless Indian savages. Destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Almost done. Every stage of this we have petitioned for redress, and he hasn't given it to us. We've even gone to the British people, asked that the British people acknowledge what we're up against, and they haven't been a help. Then the conclusion. We therefore, the representatives of the lowercase United capital states of America in General Congress. In other words, 13 independent states joining together to produce this one document. In General Congress assembled, appearing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and a right ought to be, independent states, and that they are absolved of all allegiance to the British Crown. There has been a long argument, and it's purely academic, as to whether the Declaration of Independence is a political document or a philosophical document. In the last couple of weeks, as I've read this many times and read the world around it, I've come to the conclusion that there's another description, and that's a theological or doctrinal document. They were looking to God for their protection and for their rights. Sorry I went so much longer than planned. Next week, watch the bulletin boards. There is still some uncertainty as to where we're going to meet. Coming out of the independence, things went well for a few years, and then there were problems, and we ended up with the War of 1812. We're going to talk about that next week. And then we're going to talk about Francis Scott Key. If you've had lunch with me and we've talked about legal things and so on, you know I just love lawyers. Yeah.
Why isn't there anywhere in the mention of the Declaration of Independence a problem with slavery?
Okay, slavery is another one of the things that was just so much I didn't want to bring it up this week. The Europeans especially made great fun of the Americans because the Declaration of Independence said we view that all men are created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, of which freedom. And yet many of the writers of this were slaveholders.
Yes.
Some of them freed their slaves, just a couple. It was a work in progress. I think many people like reading the scripture. The Lord talks about, Paul talks about one of the sins as being gluttony. Yeah. I think most of the people knew that slavery was a bad thing that had to be dealt with. They couldn't deal with it all at once.
And it took how long to do it?
100 years. Yep, sure did. If you'd like to, we can go into that when we could put another class in where we talk about the Constitution and the 3/5 clause and why it was there. Believe it or not, it was a strong anti-slavery clause. Many people think it wasn't, but it sure was. Anyway, good question, Charlie. And it was a big, hot issue of the day. And it took another 100 years, about even, to get rid of slavery.
Thank you.
So next week we'll talk about the War of 1812 and about a lawyer behind enemy lines on an enemy ship. He'd been negotiating, he was trapped in battle. He wrote a poem which became our national anthem. And we'll look at that next week. Thank you all.
Thank you.